Welcome, everybody, to December the 27th. If you're with us here live, I have some questions for you before we get started. Number one is, how effective are you as a writer? I mean, do you even see yourself as a writer? How about another question? How influential are you as a writer? And have you even ever thought about that question? Well, those are the things we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about our ability to communicate in written form today with our guest, who I will introduce to you in just a second. I'm glad that you're with us. Welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. If you're here live, say hello. Tell us where you're from in the chat, whatever platform that you're in. And if you're not here live, you could be in the future. You can learn more about that by going to our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to learn more and join us for future live episodes. But if you are here live, I want you to just imagine that you're joining us for a cup of coffee or a Coke or whatever your favorite beverage might be, and share your questions, your comments, and your ideas, because they'll make for a better conversation, and you will then help us make a better podcast episode for the future. So joining us live allows you to have more opportunity to get this information much sooner than if you're getting it on the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by the Remarkable Leadership Masterclasses. Each month we release a new skill in an advanced masterclass format designed to help you become the remarkable leader and human you were born to be. Details on how to get on board for a specific skill or get discounts in future months can be found at remarkablemasterclass.com. And now let me bring in our guest. There she is. And let me introduce our guest to you today. Her name is Colonel Carla Bass, retired from the U.S. Air Force. Here's her book. She's the author of this multiple award-winning book, Write to Influence, now in its second edition. Writing powerfully was central to her success in her career. Throughout her 45-year career, 30 years in the Air Force and 15 with a federal agency, she composed items sent to Congress, the White House, generals, and ambassadors, hundreds of performance reviews, awards, nominations, and budget justifications. As a squadron commander, Carla transformed her 480-person unit from the most losing in statewide professional awards to being the one to beat. How? She developed her writing methodology and taught it to her troops, teaching them how to write. So successful was her program that she taught thousands of Air Force members for the next 15 years. She now gives presentations to government agencies, corporations, private businesses, and many more, from tips to frame up an argument, to crafting resumes, grant submissions, and much more. She covers it all. We're going to talk about some of it today, right here. Colonel Carla Bass, welcome. Here's the book, Write to Influence. Welcome. I'm glad that you're here.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for the opportunity.
It is my pleasure. And we've got folks from Africa and Costa Rica and Kansas City and South Wales and Nigeria and Cyprus and Alabama. How about that? So we're so glad that everybody is here. And I want to dive in by having you talk to us a little bit about sort of how writing became a passion of yours. And you sort of gave us the storyline. I sort of shared the storyline here, but how did writing become a passion of yours and an area of focus for you?
It actually began with the 324th Intelligence Squadron. That's where it became central to my life, where I inherited the squadron that was the most losing in all of those professional quarterly and annual awards. What I saw is that super talented people were failing to win those awards, not because they didn't deserve them, which is a good double negative, but because their bosses couldn't write well. And that was impacting their careers. It was impacting pay raises. It was impacting how well they could send their children to college, all because one person up the chain couldn't write. So following my father's advice, also an Air Force colonel, he said, take care of your people, they will take care of you. I had to teach them how to write. And that's where I learned that powerful writing changes lives, because to this day, I get testimonials from people I taught decades ago saying, Colonel Bass, if it weren't for, I wouldn't have been able to. That's where it began.
So in that process, you came up with a methodology, and you obviously talk about it in the book. But before we get into some of the tips and ideas about being able to write for influence.
Mhm.
How did you develop the methodology? Like you
I
obviously
took
created it, it's been successful, it's influenced many people. How did you develop the methodology?
Well, I learned when I was a major. When I was a major, I was a division chief. That's the first time I'd gotten back into a supervisory capacity. And I learned there that whenever I submitted my people for awards, they won. I got the reputation of the major with a silver pen. So, how I developed the methodology, I took 3 days vacation time. I sequestered myself in a beach cabin and I analyzed my writing. It's Carla, you're doing something right. What are you doing? And how do you explain that to others? Out of that 3 day sequestration came the word sculpting tools, which is part 2 of the book. And I built my 1 hour workshop around those word sculpting tools, and that began what was a life changing exercise, not just for me, but for everyone whom I was able to touch. One
Good
of the
news,
one of the
everybody. Good
one
news,
of
everybody.
the compliments that I am most proud of came from Lieutenant General Dana Atkins, who's the CEO of the Military Officers of America Association. He said, by developing your right to influence training, you improved the writing of many supervisors, leading to increased professional advancement opportunities for countless numbers of military members. And that's what it's all about. It's opening doors to opportunity. And it all came from those 3 days sequestration on the beach.
We're going to talk about some of those word sculpting tools in a few minutes, but I really want to get at the question that I asked in the open before I brought you in. And I know you could hear me, but the question that I ask is, how do people feel about being able to influence in their writing? I think it's the right question that I don't think people even think about. So talk about influence as the goal, right? Because, it's the title of the book, right? To influence. So talk about why you would say that influence is the goal of our writing. As a writer, why should influence be at the top of our list of goals?
Because it's central to achieving your goals, whether they're personal or professional. So, for example, if you're writing the budget justifications or the grant submissions or that essay for a college application, you know the goal that you're trying to achieve, and you have to determine what's the best way to craft your argument, craft your message so that it resonates with the reader. And the first part of the book is all about the strategies. A couple of them would be know the audience. That's the cardinal rule in all writing. Another is when you write from the audience's perspective. When you're marketing a product, you don't highlight the attributes of the product. You write that marketing ad from the perspective of the buyer. So you have to look at it from the reader's perspective is another strategy. Another one is everybody is busy. Tick, tick, tick. What do you want? So you make sure you get the most important information up front, and then you follow it with the ancillary information. That's the strategy of don't bury the golden nugget. But it's all about influence. How it is you can convince the audience to do what you're wanting them to do is all involved in how you craft that message.
So let's talk about that for just a second. I think that's a really interesting point about length, right? Everyone's busy, tick, 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 as you said, and you talk about it in the book. How do we know what's long enough? Like, what's some advice around getting the right length, not being too wordy, but also making sure you cover the topic?
It depends on the amount of space that's available. So one of the images that I use is imagine a white rectangle, and that's one of the theories of right to influence. That depicts the fact that each writer is constrained by the amount of time available and the amount of space available to make your case. So space and time are both key proponents. If you're into a one-page letter, well, then you've got to get that key part of the message up in the first paragraph, and then the backup information follows. If you have 15 minutes of a CEO's time, imagine that you're going to accidentally get cut by 10 minutes. What's the most important information that you need to front load in the first 2 or 3 minutes? So it's all about prioritizing the points that you absolutely must get across without wasting the available time and the available space going into unnecessary detail.
So you are a proponent of outlines, right? Outline planning our writing.
Oh, huge.
And so some people would say, well, I don't have time to do that. I got to write it and beyond. So beyond with it. So like talk about, convince us why outlines or when outlines.
The biggest mistake that writers make is they fail to outline. And here's why. The outline does so many things. First of all, it adds mental discipline to your writing. It's a roadmap. You know, an engineer would not construct a building without an architectural diagram. You wouldn't take your family on a long road trip without an itinerary. An author should not launch into any kind of a significant product without an outline. It helps you gather your thoughts. It helps you identify key points. It helps you identify those points that need extra augmentation. It helps you organize the process, organize the thoughts. And then the beauty of the outline is when you're done, when you've got your first draft, you compare the outline with the draft and you make sure, one, did you hit all the key points? Two, is there extra information in the draft that was not in the outline? Is it useful? Yes or no? Is it tangential? Yes or no? If it is, cut it. Did you adequately fortify all of your contentious points? Are there holes that, try to poke holes in your argument because other people are going to do that. So the outline is the skeleton that leads to that cogent presentation.
Perfect. You mentioned it earlier. So the back half of the book is writing in specific situations. And we're really not going to talk about that unless people have questions. And by the way, we are talking with Colonel Carla Bass, author of the book, Write to Influence. Here you see it. If those of you that are here live, if you have questions about anything related to writing for influence, you feel free to ask them. We'll try to include as many as we can. But the center section of the book, to me, the ideas of the word sculpting tools is really where I wanted to spend some time. So you've got a number of these tools. And so I'm going to let you sort of, first of all, describe what you mean by word sculpting tools and then share a couple with us. Give us some examples.
Sure. Okay, I explained this. Imagine that you are a sculptor. You're in Paris, you're in that sun-drenched studio, you've got the little beret and the hammer and chisel. Because you are a master sculptor, that 6-foot chunk of marble in front of you, you know the figure that's dormant in that marble because you are the master sculptor. Word sculpting does the same thing, except in place of the marble, you have your draft. And the 10 word sculpting tools, you go sentence by sentence and you chisel out the useless words, the redundancies, the gibberish, all of that falls to the floor. And instead of 10 pages of kind of sloppy text, you've got 5 pages of hard-hitting message. That's the concept behind word sculpting. Now, here are some of the tools. The one I love most to describe is verbs. It's word sculpting tool number 3. Verbs are your friends. Rely on them. So imagine a hard-boiled egg. Make it 6 foot tall and imagine the yolk. The yolk is the actual verb. The white is the albumum, the white stuff that we use now to smother the verb. And here are some examples. Engage in collaboration is collaborate. Has a firm understanding of is firmly understands. Resulted in the prevention of is prevented. Causes damage is damages. Possess the ability is able. So sentence by sentence, you look at your verbs and you cut to the chase. You go straight to the yolk and you peel off all of that white bureaucratic blather, and that gets to a more concise thought.
I love that. I mean, obviously you grew up in and lived and worked in the military and in the government. So you use bureaucratic, that word bureaucratic word. But I think that applies to all of us in organizations. We find people might say corporatese or those sorts of things. And it's when we can strip it down, and doing that with the nouns is one of those things. Another thing that you talk about is gibberish. What do you mean by gibberish?
Yeah, there are several kinds of gibberish. One is we tend to put nouns on top of nouns on top of nouns, and that's absolutely painful. Where's my example of gibberish? I've got so many things here. Okay, I'm going to read this because it's just too horrible. I could never memorize it. The corporation will use a synchronized partner relationship knowledge management capability to enable strategic data-driven decisions regarding partners and partnerships. All right, that was a real sentence. I didn't make it up. I have no clue what it says. So gibberish, if you have to read something 2 or 3 times and you still have no idea what the guy is saying, that's gibberish. Now, the specific technique here is that nouns on top of noun on top of noun. And the example here, what I just read, was partner relationship knowledge management capability. There's 5 nouns there. And you get to the point, it's just nonsense. So that's gibberish.
Got it.
Another one of the word sculpting tools that I love to explain also, this is number 2, is called Don't Use Words That Hog Space. And there are several aspects to that, but this particular one is reducing several words down to 1 or 2. So for example, on a daily basis is daily. You never, ever, 100% never have to say on a blank basis. Daily, monthly, nationally, you never have to say on a blank basis. At all times is always. In an expeditious manner is expeditiously. Equal in capability is on par with. So again, sentence by sentence, read what you've written and see if you can condense it into fewer words.
Got it. Which is going to help us with this whole piece we talked about earlier about how much time do we have to send it? How much time do we have our audience have to read it, to understand it, etc. We have a question that's come in from Algeria. I'm going to put it up here. I haven't really read it other than briefly. So I think this goes back really, Carla, to what we were talking about earlier about how long, right? And how much time do we have? How to keep the attention of others once the first 3 minutes are gone, especially if the most important point, I'm guessing it should mean hasn't been announced. So what would your comment be to Kareem's question?
Keep the information concise, succinct, and relevant, especially relevant to the reader. Make sure that you front load the important stuff, and you don't. People they're almost hesitant nowadays to write. They put these huge preambles, almost apologetic preambles, in whatever they're writing before they get to the point. Don't do that. Another point, I helped a gal with a college application essay. There is the question, the prompt, and then what she needed to learn is answer the prompt directly. She had all of these preliminary sentences, and it took forever to get to the answer to the prompt. So if you're addressing an issue, cut to the chase right off the bat. And that's how you retain the audience's attention. Point, almost like a boxer. Boom, boom, boom.
Perfect. And we got to know those points. We got to know our audience, as you said earlier, because what are the points that will resonate with them first, right? Not just what we think is most important, but what will be most important to them. And so it takes us back to where you started, which is having a plan, having an outline. We have that.
Another one. I'm sorry. Another one of the strategies for framing your message is, again, looking from the audience's perspective, but frame it with questions. So, for example, if I'm proposing a program for Congress to fund, if I were a member of Congress, okay, what questions would I expect this proposal to answer? First question would be, how does this benefit the taxpayer? Write your 90-word elevator speech. How is this better than what we currently have? Write the 90-word elevator speech. What other alternatives are there, and why is yours better? Next question is, what happens if we don't fund it? So that's another strategy, is identify the questions that your message should answer, okay, and then write to those questions.
So Philip has asked a question, which I think it relates to a lot of what you've just said, because you've talked about get your big points out at the beginning and get those right off the bat. And some people might be asking the question Philip is asking, which is, do you advocate for executive summaries? And of course, a summary depends on how long the overall document is. But talk to this question about executive summaries for a second.
The answer is absolutely. Absolutely. And to your point, depends on how long the document is. That directly impacts the length of the executive summary. But people are busy, and so the executive summary is a golden opportunity for you to distill. It's like that old-fashioned bottle of milk where the cream rises to the top. The executive summary is a great opportunity for you to distill the key points to get your message across, in case the audience does not have time to read that 40-page report. Now, another point, and this usually relates to grant submissions, but some people suggest writing the executive summary for the grant submission before you write the grant submission. I completely disagree with that, because you cannot summarize what you have not yet written.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So we talked about some of the biggest mistakes that writers make. Are there any other mistakes that you see regularly that you would want to make us aware of?
Sure. Lack of detail. That's the second biggest mistake that people make. And this usually comes across in budget justifications, in contract bids, in resumes, and in input to performance reviews. So here's I'm going to read this again too. Sorry, I apologize. But so here's an example. This would be a resume bullet. Developed a marketing strategy that her boss approved and implemented. That's the first version of this. That's the horrible before version of this bullet. What it lacks is detail. What it lacks is impact. So the final result of this thing would be catapulted sales, an unprecedented 30% this quarter, with an innovative marketing strategy she developed. Others in the company now emulate her ideas. So that actually has two strategies. First, it has the details. The unprecedented is a subliminal word. That's one strategy. 30% this quarter alone, there's the hook. The fact that other people are emulating her, she set a trend, she's a leader, and they're following. So partially told stories beg questions, and they don't bring the story across the finishing line. So add details. Details provide a mental yardstick that enable the reader to really understand what it is that you're trying to convey.
So I'm betting you've had this experience. I know I've had this experience as an author, where people say, well, I could never write a book, or I'm not a good writer, or, and it's not, the reason I bring that up is not about you or me, but about what that says about so many of us not really having any confidence as a writer. So what advice do you have for people who might be watching or listening, whether it's live or later, about if they don't feel like they have much confidence as a writer, what can they do to raise their confidence as a writer?
First of all, this is easy, okay? It's easy. If you think in terms of writing like a game, okay? So when you get down to the word sculpting tools, it's a scavenger hunt. You're looking for those wasted words, those redundancies, those words that hog space. And, oh, I found another one. So it's fun. It's scavenger hunt. Writing is like poker or chess, because you're strategizing your message. I know what your position is, Kevin, on a particular issue. I want to trump you. So I know what your points are. So I'm going to write my message that it counters your points and then puts mine forward in a better light. Writing is like photography. You start off with kind of a blurry idea, but the more you write, the more detail you add, the more clearly it comes into focus. So think in terms of Mary Poppins. She says, when there's a job that needs to be done, there's an element of fun. You find the fun, and snap the job's the game. So it's all in your perspective. And the way I teach this stuff It's easy, it's fun. I speak in terms of Rumpelstiltskin and Goldilocks. I've already mentioned Mary Poppins. So
Right.
don't be intimidated by it. Start without outline, because everybody is a storyteller. You know the beginning of the story, whether it's a budget justification or your first novel. You know the beginning of the story, and you know where you want to take the reader. You're like a tour guide. So just settle down, pull out the outline, and make your roadmap, and then flush it in with the details.
Perfect. Another question came in. People are thanking me for that last question, which means I know that there are many people that have that challenge with confidence. And so that's, I think, great. There's a question that came in that said, do you see a difference in writing skills between generations? Do you have any thoughts about that? Yolanda asked that question.
Yes. The current generations, not just the youngest ones in the workforce now, but the writing has become, I call it, fatter. There's a lot more bureaucratic blather in there than there used to be. And I think one of the reasons is that fine writing, precise writing, is no longer taught in academia. Kevin, you and I was taught word sentence diagramming. They hit grammar hard when we were in school. That seems to have gone by the wayside. So I get so many comments from kids that come out of grad school and who had all the way through their college career, they were taking AP classes and they aced all the English classes, and they still come out, they still graduate unable to make that clean, precise message that employers are so desperately seeking. So I think the writing has become more bloated in the more recent generations because it hasn't been taught.
Pradeep asks a question. It's a great question. How do you start? How do you start writing? Like, so maybe there's an element of confidence here, but there's also like, okay, maybe I've got something I need to write. How do I get started?
Find a quiet corner and start with the words "once upon a time."
All right, and that doesn't have to only be for a novel, right? You got to get something on the page in order to get started. I love that.
So, exactly. Everybody has a story. So whether it's something as simple as what did I do yesterday, or what do I want to write to my grandkids, or write a letter to a friend. So the key point is just sit down and either put paper to pen or start typing, but just get something down and start from there.
So it's interesting that we're having this whole conversation about writing and we talk about how do we start and all that stuff. And yet we write more now than we ever did because we're all writing email. So do you have any, I know there's a whole chapter in the book and I'm talking to Colonel Carla Bass about her book, Right to Influence. And Addie asked the question, and Addie, I promise we'll get to that question before we're done. Do you have any tips about email quickly?
I have an entire chapter in there about email. My friends, when I was drafting the first edition, they begged me. They said, our staff they write horrible emails. We have to rewrite their emails. And this is the CEOs talking. So okay, real quickly on email is outline the email. So in the subject line, if you have an action, remember, set the hook. Opening word in the subject line is action, capital letters, and then give the title. And then not just outline, but segregate the information. So action, here's what's required. Next bullet is due date. Here's when it's due. Background information, and then you go into the background information so that very busy reader doesn't have to go through paragraphs of stuff. And another important tip for email is if you say I asked you questions, Kevin, I sent you a request. Here's 4 questions. Kevin, can you please provide me the information? Because you're such an astute email writer, you say, Carla, here are the 4 questions that you posed. 1, 2, 3, 4. Number them so it helps me. And then here are the answers. So in the opening sentences of that email, tie it back to the email to which you're responding. Number the main points. I have 3 points for you. 1, 2, 3. So this is all like pre-digesting the information to help the reader be able to assimilate it more quickly and effectively. Because if you don't, then I'm only going to answer 2 of your 4 points, and you have to come back to me again and ask the same questions that you already did, but because you wrote them ineffectively, and I was bored trying to go through your meandering email, it's just kind of a self-fulfilling, unpleasant prophecy.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So because this is the Remarkable Leadership podcast, and we've really been talking about all of us as writers, regardless. I did think before we started to wrap up, I should ask you this question: do you have any specific tips for us as leaders, as writers, that we might want to consider?
Yes, and I'm gonna fall back to that. Take care of your people. I used to teach leadership classes when I was still active duty, and I would ask people, name 5 characteristics of your ideal boss. Rarely would anybody would say, I want a boss who can write well. But if you think about it, if you have a boss who cannot write well, he cannot submit the unit for awards, he cannot submit the people for promotions and actually help accelerate their careers. He can't justify the budgets needed to do the job. He or she cannot do so many things because they can't tell that compelling story. So writing, I view as a fundamental leadership skill that's often overlooked to the detriment of both the people, the organizations, and the mission.
Perfect. So, all right, we're done talking about writing. Now I have a couple of other questions for you that I ask every guest, Carla.
Yeah.
Well, because I have a feeling that you could talk about writing the rest of the day.
I could.
And so I want to ask you what you do for fun, and you can't say writing.
Oh man, I love baking. I love cooking. I'm a Southern Living magazine gal. We just I turned my home over for Christmas on the Saturday following Thanksgiving. That's when I flipped to Christmas, and I have a sit-down dinner for 18 people with the sterling and the crystal and the china. I print out the menus for each person, and I do all the cooking and all the baking. I just love doing that.
Even there was writing, because you write the menu. I'm just.
Well, there you go. There you go. And the other hobby, although I simply don't have much time for that, is I will occasionally try to find time for a good novel. My favorite author, I would love to meet him someday, is Daniel Silva. That man can put more sense and more feeling and more emotion into one sentence than any other author I know. So Daniel Silva, if you are out there, I've been promoting you for years.
So whether it's one of his books or another, what's something you're reading or have read recently that you want to share with everybody?
Well, I've read this. I'm reading it again because I love it so well. It's Daniel Silva's book called The Heist. And one example, I'm going to mess this up, but this exemplifies his writing style. The doorbell rang with the intensity of a screaming infant. Count the words and just you can hear that angry baby. Okay, I mean he's just brilliant. So that's what you're trying to do in anything that you write, is infuse as much meaning in as few words as possible, whether it's a blog, a novel, or that budget justification going to Congress.
Perfect. So where do you want to point people? People want to learn more about you, about your book, about you've got a newsletter. I know you got a new course coming out. Where do you want to point people so they can learn more about you and the book, etc.? Where do you want to point them?
It's www.write2influence.net. I thrill in teaching people. So I adore giving workshops or webinars. I can go from 5 minutes to 2 full days. I've done everything in between. I do a twice monthly newsletter called Write to Influence Quick Tips. You can sign on the top left of the webpage. There's a button to get that. My new project, I'm so excited about this. I'm finalizing my first online course called catapult your career right to influence. It's a 3-hour course broken into 7 individual modules that it takes you from the resume to the cover letter to strategizing the interview, the post-interview thank you note, input to performance reviews, 15 examples of here's how you excel in that dream job once you nail it. Pre-sales will start, I'm thinking, next week, and it formally comes out in middle of February. I've spent a year working on this project, and it's my new baby.
Writetoinfluence.net. You can learn more about the course, about getting the book. You can get the book anywhere books are sold. And Carla, it's such a pleasure to have you. We're not quite finished, but I want to thank you so much for joining us and for being a part of this podcast. So now a question for all of you out there who are listening or watching, and that is, now what? What action are you going to take from this? Maybe there's one of the specific word sculpting tools that you realize that you need to work on. Maybe you learned something about building your confidence, or something about getting started with your writing, or maybe you took a tip from email specifically. Whatever it is, the challenge from this is to say, what am I going to actually do now differently or better so that I can write to influence? So Carla, again, thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It was a blast.
And everyone, thank you so much. Where will the course be published? Someone asked. You can just go to writetoinfluence.net to learn more about that. And I want to thank all of you for being here on the final live episode of the year. This won't be going out on the podcast for several months, but for those of you that are here live, we appreciate you being here. For those of you that are on the podcast, whenever you might be listening to this, we are so glad that you're joining us. Hope you'll be back next week. Hope you'll invite a friend to join you or share these episodes with them. And with that, remember that we're here every week. And so we'll be back next week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.